Hi everyone, welcome to the Astro channel. Today we're gonna talk about eyepieces, which are essential for any observation through a telescope in astronomy. I'm glad to be standing next to David Nagler, who is president of Televue Optics Incorporated. Here it is now on the Astro channel.
Well, thank you, Christoph, for asking me to explain to your viewers about how eyepieces work and the variety of Televue eyepieces. We have over 50 different models of eyepieces that we've designed, and they're all designed for a specific reason and function. But in general, just what an eyepiece does and what it means to how you view. And I look at an eyepiece as your interaction with the image. So you have a telescope, whether it's a refractor or a reflector, that creates an image. And that image just floats out in the space. It's a big circle of an image, and it's waiting to be looked at. It's the eyepiece that you use that then looks at that image that's floating in space behind the telescope. And it's the interaction of that eyepiece with that image that determines what you see in the sharpness of the image from the center to the edge, the amount of image that you see, in other words, the true area of sky that you see, and of course the magnification, how much you have magnified that telescope image that's floating in space. So if we look at the anatomy of the eyepiece, the telescope image that's floating in space must meet up with this little ring in the eyepiece, and that ring is called the field stop. And the diameter of the field stop of the eyepiece lets in just a certain area of the image. So if the image was this big, the telescope image was this big, and the eyepiece goes up to that image, you're only seeing that field of view. That's called the true field of view. So that varies from eyepiece to eyepiece based on two factors. One is the focal length of the eyepiece. So with the Panoptic series, the Televue Panoptic series, this eyepiece has a 68-degree apparent field of view. This eyepiece has a 19mm focal length. If we move to the 24mm focal length, the longer focal length, it has less power than the 19, but look at the difference in the field stop size. The 24mm has a larger circle and therefore sees more of the image that the telescope is producing. Now, I mentioned before about apparent field of view. What we're talking about on this side of the field stop is true field. But there are then a series of lenses within the eyepiece that allow you, they act as a magnifier that allow you to see the field stop. The angle at which your eye sees the diameter of the field when you put your eye to the eyepiece, that angle is called the apparent field of view. So you're taking the true field of view that you see, that's the real sky area, and you're stretching it across the apparent field of the eyepiece. That's what the function of the eyepiece lenses do. So let's take a very simple example. The moon is half a degree of true field. So if you have an eyepiece that will show you with your telescope the full moon diameter when you look through it, you're seeing a true field of ½ a degree. But, as I mentioned, the eyepiece on this side has an apparent field of view of 68 degrees. So it's taking that full moon, that ½ a degree of true field, and stretching it to 68 degrees. So it's taking the ½ degree and stretching it out to fill 68 degrees. Now we have eyepieces as an example of different apparent fields. Our smallest apparent field eyepiece is the 50-degree Plössl. So if we were using an eyepiece that showed the moon, the full ½ degree of the moon, it would stretch in a Plössl to be 50 degrees to your eye, at your eye. Then if you move to the Delight series and you had that same ½ a degree, it would stretch across a 62-degree field, 68 degrees in the Panoptic. If we move down to the Delos series, we have a 72-degree apparent field. We have 82 in the Naglers, 100 degrees in the Ethos, and 110 in the Ethos SX series. So, what changes then? Now you've stretched that ½ a degree of true field to 50, 62, 68, 72, 82, 100, 110. 110, very wide. 50 degrees is much narrower. In order to fit the same true field within those apparent fields, you must change the magnification, therefore the focal length. So to fit the 50-degree, the ½ a degree true field of the moon in a 50-degree Plössl, you actually need half the magnification that you need to fit the ½ degree moon in a 100-degree eyepiece. To put it in another way, you can use twice the power in a 100-degree eyepiece to see the same true field of view in a 50-degree apparent field eyepiece. I know that's a lot to think about, but think about it. So I consider the eyepiece in maybe a different way, the eyepiece telescope relationship in a very particular way. The telescope forms the image, and that image is just hanging there in space. It's called the aerial image. Then the eyepiece looks at it. And the eyepiece has its own set of characteristics. The telescope is producing one image, whether it's a Newtonian or a refractor. It all has the characteristics of that objective floating there in the image. And then the eyepiece looks at that image and interacts with it. And I consider it like this. The telescope is like a piece of music, okay? That piece of music is on a music stand, and suddenly the musician has to come and play that piece of music. I look at the eyepiece as the musician, because no two musicians will play the same notes off of a piece of paper the same way and have the music sound exactly the same. So depending on the characteristics of the eyepiece you choose, it will really bring out different aspects of the image, and it's also your interaction with the image. Okay, so now that you understand the role of an eyepiece and a little bit of how it works, how do you go about choosing an eyepiece? 50 different eyepieces are a lot to choose from, but you don't really need 50 different eyepieces. The first experience you want to have is with what you feel comfortable with in terms of the eye relief and the field of view of the eyepiece. So the eye relief is simply the distance from your eye to the eyepiece to see the full field. When you see that full field, that distance is called the eye relief. Some eyepieces have long eye relief, most comfortable and useful for eyeglass wearers, and some eyepieces have shorter eye relief. Some people feel that getting closer to the eyepiece and nestling up to it is more immersive in the image. But that's purely a personal choice, as is the line of eyepieces that you choose or pick from, depending on the apparent field of view. Some people like a very small apparent field of view, like a 50-degree Plössl, because they feel that they can focus in on the center of the image better without the peripheral. But I happen to like very wide field eyepieces. For instance, our Ethos design, which has 100 degrees, because to me, my natural vision is unencumbered. I can see a very wide field in my natural vision, and that's what I want to see when I look out into space. I want to look at the object, obviously, in the center of the field, but I want to see the context of the stars around it. So I like the wide fields. We have fields, all different fields in between. Other aspects to consider are your telescope. All right. If your telescope is sensitive to balance, you might want to choose a series of eyepieces that are all in a similar weight class. That may mean that in order to get the range of magnifications you want, you have to cross between lines. So, for instance, we have this very heavy panoptic 2-inch, okay? So that might be inappropriate for a telescope that is very lightweight, where you may choose to get your maximum field out of this 24 panoptic. But in order to get higher magnification, we don't make shorter focal length panoptics than 19 millimeters. So you would choose a range of eyepieces that are similar weight, and we have them in either our Delight series. So here now is a 5 millimeter focal length in a similar weight as the 24 panoptic. The 24 has 68 degrees of apparent field, and the Delight has 62. So similar. Another series you might choose with that is the Nagler Type 6, similar in size, similar in weight, but the Nagler has 82 degrees of apparent field, so much larger than the 24. Now recognize that the 24 is giving you a low power and a very wide field, and by going to these other eyepieces, we're increasing the magnification and reducing the amount of true field. That gives you your range of eyepieces or choices of magnifications to use on appropriate targets, whether you're looking at the moon at high power or planets at high power, or a large deep sky object like the Andromeda Galaxy. You really need to choose your eyepieces appropriate to the target. And when I say eyepieces, I mean your magnifications that are appropriate to the target. Another factor, of course, is your budget. The simpler the eyepiece, the simpler the design of the eyepiece, the less or the fewer elements or lens elements that are needed in the design, the lower the cost. We sacrifice maybe a little bit on correction, a little bit on eye relief, but with Televue, our philosophy is to show the sharpest image across every field of view. So even in our 50-degree Plössls, they will show you as sharp an image as a Plössl can show you across that field of view. So whether it's the 50-degree Plössl or the 100-degree Ethos eyepiece, that philosophy holds true. The Ethos requires many more elements than the Plössl to obtain that correction across the field. But that's what Televue is known for. Sharpness from center to edge, wherever the object is in the field, whatever the stars look like, even down to the fastest telescopes. And I'll just move into the telescope for a second to explain that comment. So telescopes, like camera lenses, have a focal ratio. A fast telescope has a lower number than a slower telescope. So an F10 telescope is slower than an F5 telescope. The faster the telescope, the more demanding it is on the eyepiece performance. So if you have a Dobsonian telescope, which are typically F5 or faster, they're more demanding on the performance level of the eyepiece in order to see the sharpest image across the field. And that's why we correct all of our eyepieces for very fast telescopes. Because if they work with fast telescopes, they'll work with slow telescopes. The opposite is not true in an eyepiece design. Well, one way of increasing the number of eyepieces you have without buying individual focal lengths is to use either a Barlow lens or a Powermate. And they're two different optical designs, but their function is to simply shorten the focal length of an eyepiece that you're using. Now, we make Barlows and Powermates in different magnification factors. My suggestion is you choose the magnification factor that best suits your series of eyepieces so that you don't duplicate focal lengths, okay? And the other important thing is you don't over magnify for your telescope. And remember that the magnification, the maximum magnification you can use is generally determined by the amount of turbulence you have in your atmosphere. And that changes from moment to moment, night to night. But what are the differences between the Barlow and Powermate? So here we have an example of each. We have the 3X Barlow. The 3X Barlow has a doublet lens in the bottom of it, okay? And that lens is of negative power. And what that means is, as the rays are entering the Barlow, or the rays coming from the telescope, are converging to a focus, they hit the negative lens, and now they're diverging, okay? And as they diverge, they then enter the lenses of the eyepiece, all right? And if the lenses of the eyepiece are sufficiently wide enough, large enough in diameter, all of those rays, even though they are now not entering the eyepiece as they normally would on their normal path, they will still make it through the eyepiece, and you'll see an image from one edge of the field stop of the eyepiece clearly to the other edge of the field stop. Some eyepieces, however, the designers don't necessarily take into account the use of a negative lens or a Barlow lens in front of the eyepiece, or even if they do, they might not take into account as strong a negative lens as you can use. Barlows come in different lengths, and the shorter the length of a Barlow for a given magnification factor, the shorter that is, that means the more strength that negative lens has, and the more those rays will diverge, okay, making an increase in the problem entering the eyepiece, okay? That's why we design our Barlows with generally a longer barrel, and so as not to have that type of problem. But in some eyepieces, like Plössls, they would have to be overly large to get all the rays through. The same's true in our larger Panoptic series. The eyepiece would have to be made much larger in diameter, therefore heavier and more costly, in order to be used with a Barlow without having this vignetting, or this clipping of the light at the edge of the field, the rays at the edge of the field. The other thing that happens when those rays don't make it through is the eye position, or what we call the eye relief, that is moved out. That exit pupil is moved out, and that causes other aberrations, a chromatic aberration at the edge of the field. So how do we eliminate that for those eyepieces? Well, we come up with a more complex design called the Powermate. So the Powermate has a negative lens in the bottom, but then it has a positive lens, a weaker positive lens above it that redirects those diverging rays towards the optical axis. And if they're parallel to the optical axis, it's called telecentric. So these Powermates redirect those rays more towards telecentric. Now they enter the eyepiece at a more normal height, therefore you don't have the vignetting and you don't have the movement of the exit pupil and the additional aberrations that causes. One additional benefit to the Powermates is they are better for imaging than typical Barlows, and they're all constructed so that you can remove the eyepiece holder and with a lot of threads, remove the eyepiece holder, and you can add a ring for photography, a threaded ring, there we go, that now allows you to put a camera T-ring on it. So you have a very solid connection, properly spaced, from the Powermate to your camera.
Well, this episode about how to choose an eyepiece is now over. Well, as you could see, designing an eyepiece is a real piece of art. As David said it himself, it's like a musician playing a piece of music. I think it's an appropriate description. Well, I want to warmly thank you, David, for all your explanation. I want to thank you for your excellent products. Thanks to them, we can better enjoy our passion. It's time to thank you all for your attention, and see you soon on the Astro channel.
Thank you for having me, Christophe.